The presentation of anarchism as social philosophy which aims at the emancipation, economic, social, political, and spiritual of the human race. The emancipation.
Anarchist Essays is brought to you by Loughborough University's Anarchism Research Group. For more information on the ARG, see the link in the show notes or follow us on Twitter at ARGLBORO.
L.A. Motler, A Deaf Anarchist, by Steve Emery and Dai O'Brien. Read by Isobel van Hagen. There has been very little written about disabled anarchists, and when there is, their disability is either minimized or portrayed as something that they had to bravely overcome, rather than being an intrinsic part of their lives and politics. In this podcast, we're going to look at the life and politics of Leonard Augustine Motler, an anarchist communist who was active in the early 20th century, who described himself as deaf without speech. We'll talk a little about the social context of his life as a deaf person in the early 20th century first, before going on to discuss his politics in more depth in the second half of this podcast. Motler was born in 1888 in Barton upon Irwell, near Salford. It was a working-class area with a strong Catholic community. By the time he was 3, the family moved within sight of the Eccles Cross, which was a local gathering point for industrial action, so he would have seen marches, demonstrations, and other political gatherings as he grew up. Motler was deaf at the age of 5, apparently caused by a blow on the head from a collapsing shop awning. Education for deaf people in the latter part of the 19th century was far from ideal. The prevailing pedagogic philosophy was that of oralism, which forbade the use of sign language in the classroom, in favor of focusing only on speech and lip reading. It was not a particularly successful approach, and only worked well for those who already had language, those who had some useful residual hearing, or like Motler, were deafened after first acquiring language through speech. Motler loathed his time in school. He ended up being sent to St. John's Catholic School for the Deaf, in Boston Spa, 60 miles away from Salford. This was the only Catholic deaf school in the UK at the time, which may explain why his parents sent him there, rather than to the more local Institute for the Instruction of the Deaf and Dumb in Old Trafford. This was actually a relatively lucky break for Motler, as St. John's, or Boston Spa as it was better known to the UK deaf community, was one of the few schools which still allowed the use of sign language and fingerspelling in class. Despite this, Motler was scathing in his evaluation of his education. He later wrote a column called The Priest-Ridden Deaf for Freethinker, which criticized the state of deaf education in the UK. He wrote that, quote, "Half the deaf and dumb in these isles leave school practically as yet untutored in English," and criticized the hold that the church had over every stage of deaf people's lives by writing, "These missions transact almost all the affairs of life for their congregations. They marry them, baptize them, insure them, find work for them, quote, instruct them, and finally bury them." Motler felt that this indoctrination of deaf people, which left them virtually helpless and dependent on hearing priests or missioners, started in the school system, and this played a part in the development of his politics, leaving him strongly against institutional power, including that of the church. Motler left Boston Spa at the age of 15 and moved to Manchester, where he began working as a printer. He also taught himself Esperanto and firmly embraced the revolutionary potential of the language as one which would unite the international working-class movement. Indeed, Motler's first publication in Freedom, the Anarchist Journal, was a poem, which he translated from Russian through Esperanto into English in 1912. We don't know whether Motler socialized with other deaf people in Manchester's deaf clubs during this time, but he remained in touch with at least one of his school friends from Boston Spa, George Skates, and ran a radical journal with him in London later on, which we'll talk about later in this podcast. Motler lived in Manchester through the period of the Great Unrest, from 1911 to 1914. There was a national printers' strike in early 1911, so it is very likely that he had first-hand experience of industrial action during this period. The syndicalist nature of the strikes during the Great Unrest, led by the likes of Tom Mann, probably influenced Motler's beliefs up to this point, when in 1914 he felt confident enough in his politics to begin an article in the Voice of Labour with, quote, "My dear Joe, as I told you some time ago, I am an anarchist." In 1914, Motler had also moved to London, announced in typically satirical style in the Voice of Labour, quote, "Behold, comrades, I have arrived. I have arrived in London, this great metropolis, the hub of the universe, the foremost port of the empire on which the great muse never sets." Living in London during the First World War was not easy for deaf people. Motler would have been subject to suspicion and hostility from pro-war citizens as a man who was otherwise physically fit and not outwardly disabled, but not serving in the armed forces. He was also at risk of being shot in the streets by patrolling soldiers if he didn't hear their warning shots. This happened to at least one deaf man, Charles Carroll, during the war. Motler was staunchly anti-war, seeing it as a means for the capitalist ruling class to tighten its control over the working classes. It is surprising, then, that there is an enlistment card in his name as an Army Reserve. However, it is dated from the 2nd of March, 1916, which was the date on which all eligible men were automatically enlisted if they didn't do so voluntarily. It is likely that Motler knew about this enlistment, but rather than making the Army's job easy for them, waited for them to catch up with him before he revealed his deafness and therefore his exemption from enlistment. Indeed, he is listed as discharged on the 6th of August, 1917, presumably after leading the army on a merry chase for a year. A final point before we explore Motler's politics in more detail. Motler consistently advocated for anarchist writing and propaganda to be accessible. He wanted to see more humor, more plain talking, and more pictures in the media that the movement put out. He himself wrote several articles entitled Anarchism in Plain English, and published a pamphlet of the same name. It's likely that his experience of inaccessible education during his youth inspired his conviction that the literature of the movement must be accessible, interesting, and fun. Motler's politics are evident not only in his written work, but in his actions, to which we now turn. As has been mentioned, Motler identified himself as an anarchist in 1914, and although some of his writings were published in the socialist newspaper Clarion prior to then, he also published in Freedom as early as 1912. In 1913, he wrote, "It is easily perceived that the abolition of the basis of property is the first step. Abolish the system of property and substitute collectivism or communism as you will." He was a regular contributor to the anarchist communist publication, The Voice of Labour, his first article having been published just 2 months after its launch, just before World War I broke out. At some point early in the war, he was employed at Freedom, in London, alongside the Italian anarchist Silvio Corio, who was also a printer. The Voice of Labour was strongly opposed to war, objected to conscription, and called for class war and the demolishing of the state apparatus. It was shut down by authorities in August 1916 under the 1914 Defense of the Realm Act, or DORA. It was shortly after the cessation of the Voice of Labour that Motler, as editor, along with Skates as manager, began publishing satire from the Freedom offices at Ossulston Street. Many radical writers mentioned meeting Motler and Skates while they were editing and managing satire, but what is less publicized is the content and style of this monthly newspaper, and how this reflected Motler's politics. Motler intended satire to appeal to workers, and not be too theoretical. Motler clearly believed that it was vital to build connections with workers by publishing a paper that shared their language. The satire masthead on the second page of every copy highlights the newspaper as, quote, a social critique, a rebel newspaper that, quote, is a workers' paper run by workers. It is through a reading of satire that one gets a feel for Motler's politics. While his biting humor had been evident for some time in his pre-satire writings, it is through this publication that it comes to the fore as a key weapon in the class struggle. In some instances, for example, satire rejected articles that were considered tedious. For example, quote, paragraph not sparkling enough, or, quote, regrettably too long and serious. Satire offices, which had moved to Camden, London, were raided by police in December 1917, and, just a week before Christmas Day, Motler was provided with a summons to appear before the magistrate's court. Initially, Motler and his comrades had no idea what charges they faced, fearing the enormity of the raid meant Motler would be tried for treason under Dora, something that could carry the death penalty. Instead, they were charged under the Lottery Act of 1823 for selling 4 lottery tickets and advertising their sale in satire. Motler received a £25 fine, and in a response that typified his humor, wrote in satire that several lottery sales had been taking place up and down the country, including a Christmas one run by the wife of the Prime Minister, Mrs. Lloyd George, at Selfridge's. Motler pointed out that a police officer turned the wheel from which the winning ticket was drawn. The raid and arrest highlighted the growing influence of satire and was even brought to the attention of Parliament in February 1918. After the war, Motler had a regular column in Sylvia Pankhurst's Workers' Dreadnought until 1913. Pankhurst was an admirer, commenting that Motler, quote, wrote with a caustic and racy humor which made me laugh over his proofs in spite of myself. He supported the 1917 Russian Revolution, and particularly the workers' councils that had formed, writing a pamphlet in support of establishing similar, quote, Soviets in the UK. More pertinently, Motler is credited with being the first anarchist communist to print warning signs that not all was well with the revolution. In December 1917, he wrote, "The Russian Revolution is running agly," which is a dialect term for awry or askew. These little things happen when the people permit new rulers to pose as their saviors, instead of saving themselves by running the country on their own. Motler was, quote, let go of his job at a printing machine company after the war. In fact, this redundancy was an implicit way of firing Motler for trying to organize workers there, having set up a workplace meeting. This episode highlights that Motler was politically active on the shop floor. Motler's activism is also apparent as he set up the anarchist propaganda group at the Easter Anarchist Conference in 1919. In the early 1920s, Motler wrote that he was increasingly concerned about the political situation in the early 1920s and expressed these fears in a letter to Freedom editor Tom Keel. Sylvia Pankhurst and Guy Aldred had been served with prison sentences for their activism. The formation of the Communist Party of Great Britain, CPGB, was followed by the splitting and fractionating of the British socialist, anarchist, and communist movement. Whatever the reasons, on the 6th of May 1921, Motler set sail for South Africa, where he stayed for several years. It has been argued that he became sympathetic to Leninist-type communist politics in the 1920s, but further research is required to determine whether this was the case. When he returned to London in 1925, he contacted Keel to outline his plans to form a federation in the UK to unite the various groups that wanted to be active for workers' rights outside of Parliament. This action highlights that Motler had his own views and ideas on what needed to be done politically within the radical left and anarchist movement, and he was willing to take a lead in putting them into action, ultimately unsuccessfully. He returned to South Africa, and while not much is known about his life there, he did work in journalism for the Printers' Trade Union, and continued to write articles for the Printers' Journal, as well as publish poetry. In summary, Motler was engaged with anarchist communist ideas and practice during turbulent times. Motler communicated through the medium of written English. His involvement in the politics of the hearing world, rather than the internal politics of deaf communities and associations, as so many of his contemporaries did, sets him apart. While there were other deaf anarchists at Motler's time, he is unique in the fact that so many of his contributions, beliefs, and agitations have been immortalized in print. Satire deserves to be recognized as far more than merely a comic paper, and Motler's contributions elsewhere also deserve recognition. He possessed a humor which was sharp and acidic, and yet always used in service of the anarchist cause. Motler was a true author, writing fiction, poetry, propaganda, and political commentary with insight and a caustic wit. That he was able to do so over 100 years ago, before the advent of modern hearing technology and supposed advancement in the education of deaf children, is surely a poke in the eye to the oddest, ableist education system that so many deaf children still suffer through. Maybe more than anything, that legacy should be something to which we hold fast.
Thank you for listening. To help others find Anarchist Essays, please rate and review us wherever you find your podcasts. And if you're interested in anarchist ideas, why not check out the journal Anarchist Studies? For over 20 years, Anarchist Studies has been publishing original research on the history, theory, and practice of anarchism. For more information, visit www.lwbooks.co.uk/anarchist-studies.